Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. It is Monday, February 5th, 2024 at 10 a.m. We are here to resume the hearing in docket number 2023-154E. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Urban. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. I'm going to recognize our staff counsel, Ms. Clausen, to read the docket.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. We're here today in docket number 2023-154-E, South Carolina Public Service Authority's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan. This matter was noticed for today at 10 a.m.
Thank you, Ms. Clausen. Let's take appearances from the party, and this will take a few minutes because we've got a full house, looks like, and welcome everybody. Let's just start with, I know we're here today to hear from the Commission's third-party consultant, but let's take appearances. Who's representing South Carolina Public Service Authority, also known as Santee Cooper?
Good morning, Chair Belzer. Stephen Palger for Santee Cooper, and with me is Ashley Cooper, Alex Brazil, Belton Ziegler, and in the overflow seating, Megan Driggers.
Thank you, Mr. Palcher, and welcome. Interveners, we have Sierra Club. There you go.
Oh, I don't have a red light, so I'll just...
I see it.
Okay, great. So good morning, Dorothy Jaffe on behalf of the Sierra Club, and also appearing virtually is Bob Guild and Isabella Orisa.
Thank you, Ms. Jaffe, and welcome. Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association.
Chair Belser, Richard Witt for SECEBA, and John Burns is also participating pro hoc vici.
Thank you, and welcome. Century Aluminum, South Carolina.
Chair Belser, Commissioners, good morning. Taylor Spear for Central Aluminum.
Good morning and welcome. South Carolina Coastal Conservation League and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy.
Good morning, Chair Belzer. Emma Clancy appearing for CCL and SACE, and appearing virtually with me are Christina Tidwell and Kate Mixon.
Thank you, Ms. Clancy, and welcome to you as well. Central Electric Power Cooperative.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Frank Ellerby for Central Electric Power Cooperative, and Chris McDonald of the Tinkin Law Firm is appearing virtually. And I promise not to say anything else for the rest of the day, so won't have to delay anything.
I will not hold you to that should the need arise, Mr. Ellerby. Thank you and welcome. Santee Cooper Industrial Customer Group.
Madam Chair, I'm Scott Elliott. I represent the industrial group.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott, and welcome to you. Google LLC.
Madam Chair, Mary Shade here, and Will Cleveland has joined me as Google's counsel.
Thank you, Ms. Shade, and welcome to you, Mr. Cleveland. Nucor Steel Berkeley.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. Rob Smith with Moore and Van Allen on behalf of Nucor Steel Berkeley.
Good morning, Mr. Smith, and welcome to you. And Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. Ben Muschin for ORS.
Thank you, Mr. Muschin, and welcome. Did I get everyone? Okay. Before we start with the witnesses, we have a preliminary matter. I believe we have a motion that was filed by Santee Cooper. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Chair Belzer. The Santee Cooper filed this motion to strike, and as we indicated, it was really to seek clarification on a statement, and then we may or may not need the motion to strike. Since then, we've received discovery responses from PA Consulting, and PA Consulting clarified for us certain recommendations as it relates to the procurement of solar, and it relates to a natural gas combined cycle plant. And PA Consulting clarified in their discovery responses that they're not seeking any sort of change to the 2023 IRP. They're not asking the Commission to require Santee Cooper immediately seek a procurement. We thought that might have been the case. We just wanted to be certain. And they've clarified that. And so we think that these recommendations, according to PA Consulting, as they can confirm later, are really more just things to think about going forward in future IRPs or annual updates. So with that, the company would like to reserve all rights to the extent there's something that's inconsistent with this understanding. But if that's the case, we withdraw our motion to strike at this time.
You're withdrawing at this time,
Based on our understanding and in agreement, should.
but
and so
what you're telling me is that depending on the testimony today, you may try to
Or
reinsert it?
I may just raise a motion to, at that time. I may object at that time.
Well, an objection to the testimony is one thing. Motion to strike.
Sorry, just without waiving my rights to object to
Okay.
testimony. Sorry.
So
Chair.
the motion to strike has been resolved.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other preliminary matters that need to be addressed before we begin? Okay. The order we'll go in this morning is the commission's third-party consultant witnesses will testify first. Then we will go to the intervener witness, and we will go to Santee Cooper last, since Santee Cooper has the burden of proof in this case. And with that, PA Consulting Group, Mr. Janasek, and I'm going to need some help with Miss Sarah's last name when she gets up here. I apologize. Should have done that beforehand. Ms. Kara, if you'll swear the witnesses, please.
If you would both please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
And I'm going to ask that you each state your name for the record, please.
My name is Charles Janasek.
My name is Sarah Luba Bilbao.
Say that again for me.
Sarah Luba Bilbao.
Okay, thank you. We are accepting y'all as a panel, but Mr. Janasek, will you be starting off, giving us a report?
I will.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Commissioner Belzer, Commissioners, good morning. I'm Charles Janasek with PA Consulting. We have filed a report in this docket concluding our review of Santee Cooper's 2 IRP filings. And I do have a short statement summarizing our report.
Mr. Janasek, before you begin, I would, this report was filed with the commission on, was it December, the original report was filed on December
22nd.
22nd. And then I believe another copy was filed on January 2nd because there was a confidential designation that the commission was not clear if there was confidential material. I believe you clarified that there was no confidential material in the report.
Correct.
Okay. All parties were served with the report and with the corrected report that removed the confidential designation. I'm going to accept the report. I'm going to mark for identification the report, independent review of Santee Cooper's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan filed by PA Consulting will be marked for identification as Hearing Exhibit 25 and admitted into the evidence of this case. Is there any objection? Hearing none, it is so admitted. Now, Mr. Janasek, if you'd proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Belzer. PA Consulting developed our report filed December 22nd, 2023, summarizing our independent review of South Carolina Public Service Authority's, otherwise known as Santee Cooper, 2023 Integrated Resource Plan, filed May 15th, 2023, and the supplemental update, the IRP update, filed October 27th, 2023. Santee Cooper's IRP update provided details on its modeling of the original IRP, followed by its IRP update, which was developed and modeled in response to interveners' comments, primarily the Office of Regulatory Staff. The IRP update provided details on its preferred portfolio supplemental, which described various resource retirements and additions to the Santee Cooper as its preferred portfolio. In evaluating Santee Cooper's IRP, PA determined whether Santee Cooper met its compliance with the requirements set forth in Section 40 of Act 90 and assessed its supplemental preferred portfolio for reasonableness for feasible execution. PA's evaluation included a review of Santee Cooper's supplemental portfolio to consider its forecasted energy demand and impacts from facility retirements and sensitivities. We considered Santee Cooper's ability to meet projected needs given resource availability, market constraints, potential policy implications, and other factors. PA concluded that the IRP update exhibits a comprehensive power planning effort aligned with the core principles outlined in Section 40 of Act 90, while striving to attain an effective and fair energy resourcing plan for the benefits of Santee Cooper customers. While Santee Cooper's 2023 IRP update presents a viable roadmap for the future, our assessment revealed several key areas which we will believe necessitate ongoing monitoring on the behalf of the Commission and further demonstration by Santee Cooper in subsequent IRP iterations. PA recommends that the Commission consider requesting that Santee Cooper demonstrate the following in subsequent IRPs and IRP updates. Refinement of load forecasting. The Commission should consider requesting that Santee Cooper pursue further refinement of its load forecasting methodologies for the accuracy and appropriateness in determination of assumptions, such as considering economic development impacts and anticipated growth in the region. PA recommends that the Commission consider requesting that Santee Cooper procure more solar than described in their preferred portfolio at a minimum pace of at least 550 megawatts of solar resources per year beginning in 2026. Lastly, PA recommends that the Commission withhold any approvals for the proposed gas facility and that Santee Cooper refrain from making any definitive and binding commitments to a natural gas combined cycle resource until a more comprehensive exploration of alternative options is conducted. PA's independent evaluation of Santee Cooper's IRP concludes that the IRP not only aligns with the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, but also meets the needs of Santee Cooper's customers.
Thank you, Mr. Janusek. Does that conclude PA Consulting's summary of their IRP?
It does.
Of their report on Santee Cooper's IRP?
It does.
Thank you. Sierra Club, any questions?
Good morning. My name is Dory Jaffe on behalf of the Sierra Club.
Good morning.
And my questions aren't directed at either one of you specifically, so whoever is more appropriate to answer, that would be fine. First, referring to the bottom of page 27, and it goes on to 28 of your report, you discuss Santee Cooper's current long-term forecast and generation technology selection as posing risks to reliability if there were an aggressive clean energy transition, such as the tightening of environmental regulations. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And would one of those environmental regulations you refer to be the proposed Section 111 rule?
Amongst others, yes.
Okay, and so some of those others could be like the mercury and air toxics rule that's also pending?
Perhaps.
Okay. And as a reminder, the Section 111 proposed rules sets limits for new gas-fired plants as well as existing coal and gas units and has various levels of options of how to comply with those rules. Does that sound right?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And if I could refer you to page 37 of your report, the second to last paragraph, isn't it true that you state that the proposed EPA 111 regulation poses a significant threat to the retirement plans of coal plants like Wynya and Cross?
Correct.
And then also in that same paragraph, you state that PA refrains from making recommendations to the Commission based on speculative policy. Is that also correct?
Correct.
But the proposed 111 rule isn't a policy, it's a proposed regulation, isn't it?
Correct.
And as a regulation, when it takes effect, it must be complied with?
When it's finalized and takes effect. Correct.
And are you aware, or does this sound subject to check, that the EPA is planning to finalize that rule sometime this spring?
I was unaware that they have given this spring as that date, but I know they are trying to finalize it as soon as they can.
Okay. And in reviewing Santee Cooper's IRP, you reviewed their modeling. Is that correct?
Correct.
And have you also reviewed modeling done by other utilities and other IRPs?
Yes.
And in that sort of IRP modeling that you review, do you often see sensitivities to things like high and low load forecasts, fuel costs, and carbon pricing?
Correct.
And those are projected out into the future, right? So they're proposed.
The assumptions around those sensitivities, yes.
Okay. And there's no current federal CO2 price, is there?
There is not.
So any modeling done on a CO2 price is speculative.
It is speculative.
And so you're recommending to the commission also in your report, pages 29 to 30, that Santee Cooper should adjust their forecasting and plan around more industrial growth in line with what other utilities in the Southeast are seeing. Is that right?
Correct.
And not all of that economic development that you're referencing is firm commitment. So some of it is speculative or projected to occur.
Correct.
And so you would agree with me then that you would need some level of planning around this proposed or speculative industrial growth. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what would the consequences be of not planning for that?
Well, the consequences would depend on whether or not it materializes.
So if it were to materialize and they failed to do any pre-planning for it, what would the potential consequences be?
Well, the potential consequences would depend on the magnitude of the realized growth, if we're talking about load growth, and they could potentially either over-procure or under-procure, depending on the magnitude of that eventually realized growth.
Okay. And so I believe it's page 29 to 30. You list some certain consequences such as reliability concerns and economic risk implications. Is that also true?
Yes.
Okay. So if you're recommending that the commission have Santee Cooper plan for this industrial growth that the other Southeast utilities are seeing, then wouldn't it also be prudent resource planning to run a sensitivity on the impacts of something like the proposed Section 111 rule, a rule that your report specifically said has the potential to influence all resource planning in the region, expediting thermal asset retirements and altering the energy landscape?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
So my question is, if it's your recommendation that Santee Cooper should be planning for future industrial growth similar to what other utilities are seeing, like Georgia Power, more recently Duke, and I believe you also listed Dominion Energy in Virginia, if it's appropriate to be running different forecasts to accommodate for that industrial growth, isn't it also true that Santee Cooper should be doing the same thing when it comes to the proposed 111 rule, which is supposed to go final this year, which has severe consequences on thermal resources?
Well, when planning for the utility and when conducting IRPs, utilities have a virtually unlimited possibilities and futures in front of them. And to make the planning effort be reasonably bounded, they have to focus on a certain number of potential things that may occur in the future. Something like a load forecast is something that all utilities do, generally do it on a continual basis, and certainly do it as part of an IRP effort. And they're very, very familiar with the load growth in their region and familiar with the economic development in their region. And they have a very good line of sight into being able to create assumptions around that. the universe of potential policy and regulatory actions is much wider, and they have a much they have less ability to project the outcome of potential rules and proposed rules as compared to what's going on in their own territory. And so they have to make decisions about what a reasonable sensitivity is and what assumptions to include in those sensitivities.
Right, I understand that, but we're talking about a very specific rule, not the whole entire universe of proposed environmental regulations, but more specifically one that your report specifically said could expedite thermal asset retirements. So more specifically, when it comes to the 111 rule, wouldn't it be prudent resource planning to run at least one sensitivity to see what the possible outcomes would be in that model? No.
I think that given the fact that the rule is just proposed and still in the process of being finalized, they have no way of knowing what the final rule is going to look like, and therefore it's not a specific rule. It is a proposed rule, and we felt it was reasonable that they didn't include a scenario to model that.
Okay. Do you happen to have Ms. Glick's testimony in front of you, her Exhibit 1, which is responses to the Sierra Club's discovery request?
I actually do not.
Well, so I can put on the overhead.
Ms. Jaffe,
yes.
are you referring to Ms. Glick's responsive testimony to the report?
Yes, correct. Her
Thank you.
supplemental testimony.
I just wanted to
Yes.
clarify. Thank you.
So Exhibit 1 to her supplemental testimony references Sierra Club request 1-9, where specifically in subsection A, it was asked, please explain how PA Consulting Group believes that Santee Cooper specifically and resource planners more broadly should plan around proposed environmental regulations. Can you please tell us what your response was to that discovery request?
If you can. Okay, I think I am there. Which response was it?
1-9.
1-9. Okay. So PA Consulting believes that these should be considerations in sensitivities, but should align with the process of retiring and planning for the replacement of aging generation.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Jaffe. Carolina Clean Energy Business Association?
No questions at this time, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Century Aluminum of South Carolina?
Nothing from Century, Chair.
Thank you. South Carolina Coastal Conservation League and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Ms. Clancy?
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Emma Clancy, and I'm appearing on behalf of the South Carolina Coastal Conservation League and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Now, I have some questions. They're not intended for either of you, so whoever would like to speak, please do so. Now, in addition to reviewing Santee Cooper's IRP, PA Consulting reviewed intervener testimony and listened to the December hearing. Is that right?
Yes.
And your recommendations are directed towards subsequent iterations of the IRP or future resource planning after this IRP proceeding, correct?
Correct.
Now, I'd like to begin by asking you to read the following excerpt at page 31, and I can put it up on the screen. Can you see that highlighted portion?
I can. Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Would you please read the highlighted section?
Sure. Santee Cooper's IRP indicates their reluctance to retire the Wynya coal plant until guaranteed replacements resources are online. As previously stated, PA recommends significantly exceeding their current solar procurement targets to mitigate potential shortfalls. This strategy should also be applied to battery storage procurement, as these complementary resources can address both energy and capacity needs. By securing substantial solar and storage resources before Wynya's planned retirement, Santee Cooper may not require the full size of the currently proposed natural gas combined cycle, ultimately enhancing their reliability in the event of project delays and reducing dependency on the proposed shared gas unit.
Great, thank you. So you'd agree that securing substantial solar and storage resources before Wynya's planned retirement is really a no-regrets strategy. It's just going to put the utility in a better position.
I would say that procuring resources in advance of the retirement, if they are cost effective, makes prudent sense.
Okay, so I'd like to unpack some of the benefits of near-term procurement raised in this excerpt. Beginning with the timing of solar and storage procurement, you would agree that solar and storage can be procured to add both energy and capacity to the system within the next several years, correct?
Correct.
In contrast, as Santee Cooper witness Dembla testified at the December hearing, the shared CC in the preferred plan would take at least 7 years to bring online. Did you hear that?
I did hear that testimony.
And PA shares intervener concerns about short-term capacity on Santee Cooper's system, isn't that right?
Correct.
So the fact that renewables can be deployed more quickly could really be a benefit to shore up near-term reliability, correct?
It depends when you say near-term shore up near-term reliability.
To shore up some of the concerns you had about near-term capacity.
Depending on the nature of the timing on when they could get solar and storage online.
Right.
That's correct.
It's a possibility that could help with that concern.
Correct.
Now, the report also notes that near-term solar and storage can decrease Santee Cooper's dependency on coal. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Can you explain how near-term solar and storage can mitigate some of the risks and costs associated with coal dependence?
Well, assuming that that Santee Cooper will retire the Wynya plant in 2030, by 2031 as stated, they will need some level of energy and capacity to replace the Wynya plant.
And before they retire the coal plant, isn't it true that some of these renewable resources might be able to provide lower cost energy and reduce the need to run higher cost coal?
They could, depending on the cost of those resources compared with the cost of the coal.
Okay. Now, right now, Santee Cooper's capacity mix is about 60% coal. Is that right?
About.
And relative to other utilities in and out of the state, that's a pretty high percentage of coal, isn't it?
That's a fairly general statement, but in general, a 60% coal mix is higher than a lot of utilities and a lot of states.
Okay. Now, at page 37, the report describes the many risks and costs associated with continued reliance on coal. And some of those risks are the industry shift away from coal plants and any, resulting commodity price volatility. Do you see that testimony or that excerpt?
I do, yeah.
And those industry pressures can also impact reliability of those plants, can't it?
They could.
And as you just discussed with Ms. Jaffe, those trends are compounded by increasingly strict environmental regulations. Isn't that right? That's a further risk associated with coal plants?
It can be, yes.
And PA expects these risks to increase the longer the coal units stay online, isn't that right?
At this time, yes.
Now, PA also notes that securing substantial solar and storage resources before WINYA's planned retirement can enhance reliability in the event of project delays and reduce dependency on the proposed shared gas unit, correct?
Correct.
So essentially, getting renewables online now will leave the utility with more options if the gas plant is delayed and can't come online by 2031. Is that what you're saying there?
Getting any type of resource online would give them more options in advance of the gas unit.
And you'd agree that projects to build large resources like the shared CC can face significant delays, especially when they require pipeline upgrades, wouldn't you?
They can.
And even assuming the gas plant is built, won't near-term renewables reduce exposure to gas price volatility and regulatory risk associated with that plant?
They would.
Now, Santee Cooper has raised concerns about relying on battery storage to meet capacity, at least in the near term. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And the report identifies one of Santee Cooper's long-term objectives as including implementation of a battery pilot program. Isn't that right?
Correct.
But on page 31, the report says storage assets are no longer a nascent technology, playing a crucial role in meeting capacity needs across the nation. And it further states that in light of its widespread adoption, PA believes accelerated storage procurement would be in Santee Cooper's best interest. Do you see that?
I do.
So you would consider battery storage to be a viable resource option to meet near-term capacity needs, right?
Yes.
And to be clear, PA does not think it's necessary for Santee Cooper to delay battery procurement until after a pilot program, correct?
I think that the utility, to the extent that it wants the pilot program to gain some operational experience with storage, it may make sense for them to wait until after they get that experience, but on a limited basis. I think the issue is that Santee Cooper has exhibited a bit of reluctance to procure large-scale storage resources in the near term, and as part of their justification for that reluctance, they've indicated that they want to learn more about how batteries operate on their system. But PA feels that storage resources, as we said, they're not a nascent technology. There are utilities across the country that have installed large amounts of storage. They have that experience. It's been demonstrated that storage is a reliable source of capacity. And so while we understand that Santee Cooper would like to gain a bit of operational experience, we don't feel that that would justify any type of long-term delay in adding storage.
Okay, thank you. Now turning to solar procurement, PA recommends that Santee Cooper target a minimum of 550 megawatts of solar per year beginning in 2026, correct?
Correct.
And those targets are based on Santee Cooper's own modeling, showing that 2,200 megawatts of solar is economic in 2029, correct?
Correct.
Right, so PA's approach spreads that economic amount over 4 years beginning in 2026. Is that right?
That's correct. But additionally, the primary reason why PA recommends additional solar, recognizing, or PA recommends more solar sooner, essentially, recognizing that the economic portfolio called for the 2,200 megawatts of solar all in 1 year in 2029. We also noted that Santee Cooper has had delays in getting the 500 megawatts of solar that its 2020 RFP solicited. And in fact, at this time, they only have about 50% of that goal actually going to be coming online. There is an additional 75. I believe that they originally contracted or targeted 425 megawatts out of that 500 megawatt solicitation, and they reached preliminary agreements for that 425, and that 200 megawatts of that is going to come online as expected. 75 megawatts of that was the PPA was canceled by the developer, and the other 150 megawatts Santee Cooper has said are experiencing delays, and they are unsure at this time if it's going to come online. So out of the 500 megawatts that they originally solicited, they are only certain at this time that they are going to have the 200 megawatts. And that really was the genesis of our recommendation, given that Santee Cooper has had difficulties and they are only getting about 50% of their solicitation. We feel that it's prudent if their plan calls for 300 megawatts on average from 2026 through 2030, that they would be prudent to solicit more than that 300 per year, given the fact that they may not be able to get everything online that they go to solicit, and the 50% is the 550 megawatts is roughly that 50%. Our feeling is if they try to procure 300 megawatts, that they may end up coming in far short of that goal.
Okay, right. So I think you anticipated my next question, but essentially, even if they target 550 megawatts per year beginning in 2026, they still may end up falling short of that economic amount that was found for 2029. Isn't that right?
Their track record indicates that they would fall short.
Okay. And just as an aside, when we talk about an economically optimal amount, that means that according at least to Santee Cooper's modeling, that's the best deal for ratepayers, right?
According to the modeling and all the assumptions therein.
Great. Now, but as you mentioned, Santee Cooper's targeting only 300 megawatts per year in their preferred plan, correct?
Yes, correct.
And so even assuming Santee Cooper met those lower procurement targets, that would mean that ratepayers could miss out on 1,000 megawatts of solar the utility's own modeling found to be economic in 2029, correct?
Correct.
Now, in response to the report's recommendations to target higher annual solar procurements, Santee Cooper witness Painter submitted testimony showing it would cost more to adopt PA's more proactive solar targets. Have you reviewed that testimony and that analysis?
I have.
So his argument is basically that because solar costs could go down in 2029, Santee Cooper's plan, which defers a portion of the economic solar procurement to the 2030s, is less expensive. Is that how you understood it?
I'm sorry. Could you restate that?
Of course. His argument is that because solar costs go down in 2029, Santee Cooper's plan, which defers a portion of the economic solar to the 2030s, is less expensive, correct?
Correct. I believe that witness Painter's testimony indicated that solar, their assumption is that solar costs will decline not just in 2029, but between now and the 2030 timeframe. And so, that's their assumption, that they assume that solar is going to decline, and that's his partial justification for delaying or not procuring more solar sooner.
Okay. Now, in his cost analysis, though, he's looking at, and you alluded to this, the costs of solar in the next few years versus the projected costs of solar beginning in 2029 and then going into the 2030s, correct?
Correct.
But he's not comparing near-term solar costs to the cost of energy that solar could displace, is he?
Not in that discussion, no.
And even in the near term, when solar costs are higher, they're still less than coal energy costs, isn't that right?
Potentially.
Well, subject to check, does it sound right to you that the average energy costs in 2026 for the Winya unit was more than $49 per megawatt hour? The average energy cost for the Cross unit was more than 47 megawatts per hour, whereas the near-term solar energy costs are just over $37 per megawatt hour.
Subject to check, correct.
So let's consider a very simplified hypothetical to better understand Painter's approach. Now, let's say I buy coffee out all the time. So I decide to buy a coffee maker to save money. If I know that coffee maker will be cheaper, if I wait until Black Friday, and let's say I could save $50. But if I wait until then, that means I'll keep buying coffee out for months, and that would add up to more than $100. So wouldn't it be smarter to make the investment now if waiting would end up costing more?
It's all based on assumptions, and yes, in that example, that would make sense to go procure more now. And in fact, in Witness Painter's rebuttal to our report, he does mention that it is not assured that solar costs will decline, and so. Yes, their primary assumption is that costs will decline, and the thinking being that it would cost more ratepayers more in the long run to procure more solar now, given that costs are going to drop. But he also notes that they're not assured to drop, and so that construct starts to break down a little bit.
So there's a risk that waiting to delay what was found to be an economical amount of solar might not actually save any money.
There's very much a risk that delaying solar may not save money. It could also increase costs as well.
May I add, we also have the intention that there will be competition at that time, assuming costs go down and knowing that similar procurement strategies will be taking shape. That puts significant procurement risk in going out and soliciting bids for that procurement. And so that was also part of the risk. And if considering economic value and competition impact, that we wouldn't want to have a direct comment on that, but knowing that that could be a situation where costs might not reflect the most optimized situation then.
You're saying down the road?
Down the road, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, changing gears, I'd like to turn to page 39. Now, could you please read these highlighted excerpts? Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
While acknowledging the scrutiny placed on Santee Cooper's projected O&M and capital costs for this facility, our primary contention is that the implicit assumption that the 1,020 megawatt gas facility is an irrefutable choice in resource procurement. Despite recognizing the concerns about reliability and capacity needs, we believe there exists potential for exploring alternatives such as a hybrid model or smaller scale facilities that integrate energy and capacity from alternate sources. And then the absence of a thorough examination into meeting this capacity requirement suggests a lack of consideration for viable alternatives. We advocate for keeping procurement avenues open and exploring avenues such as solar and BESS development to diversify options.
Okay, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Thank you. Now, so as you understand it, Santee Cooper is in the planning stages for the CC, but it's not too late to look more closely at the economics and the risk.
As I understand it, they do not have to commit yet to the plant.
And in each of Santee Cooper's foundational portfolios, apart from the no new fossil portfolio, they replace Winya with a large CC greater than 1,000 megawatts, correct?
Correct.
But PA thinks a middle ground or hybrid approach, which is not reflected in any of the portfolios, is worth considering.
Worth further considering.
So that portfolio could include a smaller gas build and more batteries.
Potentially.
Now, PA conducted a high-level economic analysis described on page 44 of your report. That's not the same as the hybrid approach you recommend evaluating, right?
Correct.
And this economic analysis looks only at the capital cost of resources, isn't that right?
Correct.
So if you compare dispatch costs like variable and fuel costs, you would get a different outcome.
Presumably.
And you also didn't consider gas transportation costs in your analysis, right?
I don't believe that we did.
Now, you don't have any reason to believe that batteries can't at least be part of the replacement capacity for Winya, correct?
No reason to believe that.
And did you hear Santee Cooper witness Wagner testify during the hearing in December?
I did.
Did you hear him say that Santee Cooper evaluated a transmission scenario showing that replacing Winya with a combined cycle and a very large battery at the Winya site was $150 million cheaper than assumed for the large CC replacement in the IRP?
Subject to check, yes.
So understanding you haven't done a transmission analysis, doesn't that testimony suggest a hybrid portfolio might also have lower transmission costs than the preferred portfolio's large replacement CC?
Without having done the transmission analysis, I'm not sure I can agree with that.
It doesn't suggest there could be cost savings.
There could potentially be cost savings, but it's also important to note that when replacing when assuming a battery goes in at a certain spot on the system has to incorporate not only generation coming from the battery, but also load coming into the battery to charge it, to store energy. And so in some cases, that can cause additional transmission constraints and require upgrades, and in some cases not.
Well, like your hybrid portfolio, it may be worth looking into more. Is that
It
right?
definitely is worth looking into more.
And in response to CCLC's data request 112, PA states that the record does not currently reflect the complete optimizations of transmission costs associated with the retirement of Winya and Cross. Isn't that right?
That was our understanding.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Clancy. Central Electric Power Cooperative.
No question.
Santee Cooper Industrial Customer Group. Mr. Elliott, any questions? Oh, thank you.
Either one of you, please, could you explain a little bit about battery storage? Doesn't it require capacity resource to charge the battery?
It requires charging energy that typically comes from the grid. Yes. I mean, yes, it takes energy to charge a storage resource.
So it's a two-edged sword in a sense, isn't it? In that way?
In that, a two-edged sword, what do you mean by that?
Well, it requires additional generation to create generation, is what I understand you to say.
It requires energy to store into the battery. It doesn't necessarily require additional capacity to charge it.
Now, would procurement of more solar in the near term provide what equivalent capacity generated by a combined cycle gas plant?
Not in terms of capacity, no.
And so if there was a need for to meet load growth from economic development, the combined cycle plant would be a more suitable candidate for a high load growth customer base, correct?
Depending on the shape of that customer's load, yes.
And we would want Santee Cooper to be able to be nimble enough to have capacity for low, medium, and high growth industrial customers or economic development generally, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Google LLC.
No questions, Madam Chair.
Nucor Steel Berkeley.
No questions, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Office of Regulatory Staff.
No questions.
Santee Cooper.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to put a few things on the Elmo just so everybody knows and can adjust. Good morning.
Good
I
morning.
introduced myself to you earlier, but I'm Ashley Cooper. I'm here on behalf of Santee Cooper. Thank you for your time. I just have a couple of things to go over with you. And this is largely out of either your report or discovery request, but I'm going to show you and tell you where I get it from. I think you covered this. This is in response to a discovery request, and I believe, Janice, you covered this in your summary, so I think this will be very quick, but just to make sure I heard you correctly, you said that PA Consulting applied core principles outlined in Section 40 along with IRP principles which influenced Santee Cooper's design. PA Consulting did not find deficiencies related to meeting those requirements. I think you said that in your opening, but is that correct?
Correct.
I'd also, if you could turn to page 24 of your report, please, sir. And I just want to ask you this one, because I know you did not find any deficiencies, but in your report, can you read what I have highlighted there?
Sure. We determined that the proposed IRP represented the most reasonable and prudent means of meeting Santee Cooper's energy and capacity needs at the time of review.
Okay. And that's still your feeling today? That statement is in your report, is accurate in your report?
Correct.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to show you something from discovery request that we sent you. And it's 1-9, and it relates to the 550 megawatts of solar. And you understood Santee Cooper's experts to say, well, actually Santee Cooper's witness to say that it was a target and not a limit, correct?
Which was
The 300 megawatts that it's identified in its IRP is a target but not a limit.
I found that Santee Cooper said that it was a target.
Right.
I also found that witness Davis indicated that it was a constraint introduced into the modeling. A limit of 300 megawatts in the modeling, in the supplemental modeling.
Subject to check, though, Mr. Painter, I believe, confirmed that if there were market opportunities that suggested they could procure more than 300, they would.
He did. So in reality, they may be able to procure more solar than the 300, but the modeling and the portfolio approach, or the preferred portfolio, was done using a limit of 300 megawatts per year.
Fair enough. And you were asked a few questions just a moment ago, and you discussed your recommendation to accelerate the pace of procurement to 500.
Correct.
That was based on two things, really, which one was the difficulties in procuring solar to date. Is that at least one of them?
Correct.
And to be more specific, Santee Cooper put out an RFP and sought third-party developers to propose these projects, correct?
Correct.
And so the third-party developers have had difficulty developing these projects to meet Santee Cooper's RFP. Is that correct?
I don't know the nature of their not being able to deliver, whether it was difficulties to development or other reasons, but the net result was that Santee Cooper has not to date been able to get its desired solar from that RFP online.
Okay, fair enough. And so you offer one thought, which is one alternative maybe to accelerate the pace. That may be a way to mitigate this risk, correct?
Correct.
If I'm correct, that the reason for the delays is because this was an RFP and third-party developers have had tough time meeting the schedule and developing what they bid on. Would another option, and this wouldn't be to the exclusion of your recommendation, but would another option be that Santee Cooper consider self-building?
Absolutely, that would be an option.
And Shazzy, if you could turn to page 44 of your report, please. And I believe you've answered some questions, a good many questions about hybrid or other approaches for the natural gas combined cycle, correct?
Correct.
But is it correct, in your report, you say you do not challenge the necessity for a gas plant considering reliability and capacity needs? Is that a correct statement?
It is.
Okay. And then just finally, this is in response to discovery issued by Santee Cooper. As it relates to the gas plant, you clarified that any recommendation about the gas plant or proceeding with the gas plant was directional guidance and not a binding requirement. Is that correct?
Correct. Our recommendation is that the commission consider not approving any commitment by Santee Cooper for the gas plant without further studies.
So in other words, that the commission follow, say, the proceedings of follow a siting act if they wanted to move forward. Is that a fair statement?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Commissioners, questions for this panel? Commissioner Carolee Williams.
Thank you. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
I am just going to go through questions to both of you and welcome answers from either one of you. Do you know when Santee Cooper's IRP update is due per our schedule? And you may not. There will be others that can answer that.
I don't know if it is set in stone. I believe their next update is proposed to be in September of this year.
And could the sensitivity analysis that we've been talking about related to the 111 rule or anything else happen at that time? If there were enough time, could sensitivity analysis be included relative to, let's say, the federal government does decide to implement the 111 rule? Could it be added at that point?
I believe so.
Given that there's enough time to do all the modeling, okay.
If the springtime is accurate, as we've heard.
Right, right. So sensitivity analysis could be added at in a IRP update.
So, yes.
Forgetting the timing, but in general, it could happen.
I think we stipulated a subsequent IRP update, so however you define that, yes.
And forgive me, some of my questions were written before the previous discussion, but I'm just going to plow through them. Page 30. And I'll be honest, I'm going to keep moving because this is a question related to methodology and anticipated load growth. That's something that can be achieved in a future IRP update. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. From your experience moving to page 32 and looking at the 81% withdrawn from the solar oasis success rate, is that something that utilities can impact? Is that something that is a typical number? I'm looking at the chart at the bottom of page 31.
Okay,
sorry, I
No,
might
that's
not have
okay.
said all that. It really does help to be in the room and see your faces.
Yeah, thank you. And so, I'm sorry, what was the question?
So the question really is, the withdrawn number is 81% of the applications that were apart from 2001 to 2022. Is that a typical number that are withdrawn? Is that a number that can be evaluated and improved upon? I guess, and am I right to think that is evidence of where some of those megawatts of power have gone, that they just are not active applications anymore? So set me straight.
It's a complicated question with interconnection queues. Across the country, interconnection queues have become quite full, and it takes a long time to clear them. And so what happens, and to the best of my knowledge, a developer will submit an application for an interconnection. And then eventually the utility or the transmission authority will study that resource and its proposed sort of characteristics in concert with other resources typically, and that's what you'll see referred to a cluster study. They'll take a group of resources and they study it, they look at the system, and they study what it's going to take in terms of a potential system upgrade to be able to accommodate that generation being sited at that particular location. But what happens is that over time, that study hasn't been completed, or if the study is completed and it says it's going to cost some prohibitive amount of system upgrades for that generator to be able to come online, then for that and other reasons, they will withdraw their application. And it's difficult to compare interconnection queues on a level basis across the country. Many markets and many utilities are trying to do what they call queue reform. They are looking at ways that they'll say they need to clear the queue, because what happens is that the queue, the spot in line to become part of the next subsequent studies, may be from a developer who put in their application years ago, and there could be lower cost technologies that are available now, but they're stuck behind these other types in the queue. And so their queue reform is definitely a hot topic right now. Everyone's trying to understand how they can manage through the amount of queue applications that are currently on the books.
And I will add to that, at a prior firm, I was part of the queue reform process for North Carolina. So a lot of these similar issues with these withdrawn projects were echoed, and that was sort of part of the impetus for setting a queue reform. So these are the type of discovery questions that would lead to this queue reform sort of situation. And that, to your original question, that's how you may begin to improve upon that number.
And so, understanding that we're participating in an IRP process, my simple question, is there any there? In other words, is there anything related to this high number that's withdrawn, the concern about having so many that are so many megawatts that are in process, but then only a certain number that are executed? Is there something that ought to be a recommendation in this IRP, understanding we can't fix everything in an IRP? And
Sure. I would say that we need to be careful to make sure that queue reform and people withdrawing from the queue is not the only reason that some projects may not come to fruition. So when we were discussing earlier, Santee Cooper's had a lot of difficulty with its 2020 solar RFP. It hasn't been able to get all of its targeted megawatts online. That's not just because of queue issues. In part, it could be. I don't have any insight into the specific reasons why those developers have not been able to get their projects online. There's also been supply chain issues as well as price increases. So, I guess back to your original question, is there a recommendation around queue reform? I think that I'm not sure that we are in a position to make a recommendation like that.
just my job to ask the question. On page 34, in the energy efficiency realm, I'm struggling to understand the difference between the approach of some of the interveners and PA's recommendation regarding methodology of getting accurate avoided cost associated with energy efficiency by including avoided transmission and distribution cost. And I think that's something that you're recommending we request further analysis on in upcoming IRPs. Is there anything you can add to that to help better inform me. Did I state anything wrong in that?
Well, specifically, we made 3 recommendations in our report, and they weren't related to energy efficiency specifically.
And I guess I noted that you had 3 big ones, but as I went through, I saw hints of other ones. So I'm really responding to those. So on page 34, I mean, if they aren't recommendations, I can leave them. But I felt like I felt like you were making one there, even though I understood it's not a big overarching one.
Understood. We do understand that, you know, they make adjustments to their modeling around what the market potential of various EE and DSM. We found them to be reasonable. At the end of the day, that's what has to occur. When you think about an energy efficiency measure portfolio, it's all theoretical about what the market potential can be. Nobody knows until you go and actually solicit interest in those particular measures and portfolios. And so looking at the market potentials and then thinking about how they adjusted them, it made sense to us. So we didn't have any particular concern with that.
And I didn't note in my document exactly what I read, but but from my notes, is there something that you were suggesting related to avoided cost and transmission, capturing avoided cost associated with transmission distribution that you were suggesting?
We do know that there were comments made, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me, but that subject to future transmission studies, more information would be revealed. And I think this was a comment to encourage those, in that you'll find more, you know, outside of just looking for stranded assets or other avoided costs that you will uncover under that. And that would relate to, you know, this DSM study, which I know there was a lag in between the last market study for Santee Cooper, and so this being more recent, you know, just to continue that forward motion and then to continue some of those alternatives. So perhaps, I'm speculating even on this, but perhaps that it was the intention, not so much a recommendation, but an encouragement for what they had already echoed.
And I think the issue is that one of the interveners noted that as they consider the costs of energy efficiency, they consider the cost of avoided capacity and energy, but that intervener was noting that they hadn't yet considered the costs of avoided transmission in that energy efficiency. And we would say that it's difficult to make a blanket recommendation because some of those measures may not, depending on their location on the system and the type of measure that it would be, may not incur any avoided. An avoided transmission metric wouldn't necessarily be applicable, but certainly in some cases it would make sense to include the avoided cost of transmission on the specific energy efficiency measure or even a portfolio of measures. Does that help?
That does.
Yeah.
That does. I think we wrapped all 3 of our heads around it.
Thank you.
I don't know about the rest of the room, but so on page 36, I think I'm just curious and need reminding why the capital cost comparison between NREL and South Carolina is so much higher per kilowatt, where the levelized cost of solar is more similar to NREL's Class 5 solar. if that question makes sense.
You're asking about figure 10 and figure 11?
I am.
And you're asking why the estimate for solar versus Santee Cooper's solar versus NREL's solar?
You know what I'm seeing today, because I took these notes quite a while ago. What I'm seeing today in figure 10 is that wind is, for Santee Cooper, is much higher in cost than NREL's study. Is that true?
Well, it's difficult here, but I had understood it that it actually was the reverse, and that the Santee Cooper assumption for solar is higher. But I see now that it actually is the wind. What we had understood in looking at the NREL classifications was that NREL it's more of a general regional approach, and that Santee Cooper felt that given its specific region, and that there's a little bit less of a wind resource specifically here, that it would be the NREL is more of a generalization, and the Santee Cooper assumption was more specific to the Santee Cooper region and what its wind resource would be right here.
And that makes total sense, especially when I see that we're talking about onshore.
Yeah.
And then I might have been looking more at figure 11, because there, what I see is NREL's numbers are all, especially as you go out into the future, much lower than Santee Cooper's estimates. Correct? Am I reading that right?
They are, yeah. And again, I think that it is due to specific capital costs include not only the equipment, but also labor and land cost and land availability. And we understood this to be that that according to their assumptions, informed by the local resources here and local land and local labor availability, that they assumed those higher levels of capital costs. And I will say that that tracked I'm not going to say the specific numbers track, but directionally it tracks with PA's internal modeling, which doesn't assume a lot of wind availability, wind resources here. And typically when that happens, when you're talking about putting a resource where there's not a lot of a comparable market, then you're going to end up with higher costs because you mobilizing contractors and finding the land, all of these things that go into the capital cost of an installed wind resource. They're going to be higher in an area where there's just not a lot of activity for that resource, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And is there a reason offshore isn't included? I know that's a ways out, and that may be a good reason, but
I think that's exactly right. I don't even believe at the time of the IRP there wasn't even an offshore leasing program available for South Carolina wind at the time.
Thank you. Do you know what the life of a natural gas combined cycle plant is? Number of years?
Typically, 25-year assumption is typically what is used as a lifetime.
And are you aware, from your awareness of this docket, if anybody provides testimony that helps us to think about stranded assets?
Not in this docket. I don't believe that I saw any testimony around stranded assets.
And in the future, should that be a modeling factor?
It would be. So we deal with stranded asset risk in a lot of areas outside of South Carolina, and they typically are related to what is believed to be the policy direction of that jurisdiction, right? And so if you feel that you can take some progressive jurisdictions that are aggressively pursuing decarbonization policies and laws and regulations, you can make the assumption that over time they're probably going to want no more of a certain type of resource, and then if you're building that resource, then you've got stranded asset risk. Here, we don't quite yet view South Carolina as that, but things change quickly. They change very quickly, and that's one of the reasons why, in relation to the gas plant, we had recommended that the commission consider withholding approval until it's absolutely required for that resource to come online in time to be able to replace the Winya retirement. At some point, we have to make a decision today, and at that point, if all the studies up to that point indicate that it's still the best resource, then we wouldn't recommend withholding approval.
But that decision's not a part of this IRP.
It's not a part of this IRP. However, the action plan of this IRP indicates that Santee Cooper is going to move forward with the gas plant, and so it's that was our conundrum. We recognize this isn't a certificate of need proceeding, but at the same time, it's part of the action plan for this IRP. So that's why we wanted to address it.
I'm getting, just for everybody's awareness, I'm getting to the end of my list. Are you saying explore alternatives such as a hybrid model or a smaller scaled facility that integrate energy and capacity from alternative sources?
Yes, and at the end of the day, look, our PA modeling for the Carolinas region also indicates future gas plants will be built in this region. When we do our regional modeling, we don't necessarily ascribe a particular gas plant to a particular utility, but we do look at the region as a whole and the needs that are going to occur in that region, and we do project that there would be gas plants built in this region at this time, and so we were careful not to say that we think the commission should reject outright the notion of a gas plant. Our concern is that things change fast, and we would prefer to see Santee Cooper continue to aggressively evaluate potential solutions that include potentially smaller amounts of the gas plant, right up until the day when they need to commit to a size. And that also, they can commit to some aspects of a gas plant, but they probably don't need to commit to a certain size even right away after they have to commit to some things like initial permitting or what have you. So our whole goal in that recommendation was for the commission and Santee Cooper to retain flexibility in making that final decision before it needs to be made.
Are virtual power plants impactful in your regional analysis?
They are becoming more prevalent. I don't have any specific knowledge about what our modeling would say about VPPs here in the Carolinas region. What I do know, just from my experience, is that they tend to be more clustered in higher density areas. Virtual power plants tend to be distributed solar and distributed storage resources that can get aggregated up into a dispatchable entity, essentially, and it takes a high density of potential DERs before you can get to a viable virtual power plant. But to be clear, we didn't. That's my experience. We didn't really address it here.
And I think you've already mentioned CPREs as a possibility. You know, I'm going to take that one back. What I wrote, my note was all source CPREs, and whether that made sense, but I'm not sure that it's all that relevant to go into that. So if that brings on a thought, I will let you talk, but I'm also willing to let it go.
It certainly could be studied by Santee Cooper, VPPs and something along those lines. In all of these studies that we're recommending, even Witness Painter had mentioned that, if further planning moves Santee Cooper away from the natural gas combined cycle, that scenario would be addressed in future IRPs and IRP updates. And it's certainly, I would imagine that as the years to come, VPPs will be a bigger part of those studies.
And just to be clear, I wasn't meaning to connect the VPP to the idea of all source CPREs.
Okay.
I wasn't clear at all. I see that Commissioner Caston and perhaps others are ready to go. So
Commissioner, we're going to take a break, and that'll give you and other commissioners a chance.
Perfect.
I know you've got a lot of notes because you take a lot of notes. And that's a good thing.
Thank you.
Let's take a about a 12-minute break and come back at 11:40. Is that right? 11:40. Yeah. Thank you. Good morning and welcome back to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina as we continue in this hearing in docket number 2023-154-E. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carolee Williams, Commissioner Caston, Commissioner Belser, and with us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin. We will continue with the independent consultants. We are on questions from commissioners, and Commissioner Carolee Williams, if you'd like to continue.
Thank you very much. I have 2 remaining questions, so I'm happy to keep going. I'm going to ask everybody this question, and it's just an idea that I have. As I listened to Santee Cooper, and I heard them talk about the number of megawatts of solar on an annual basis, not being that it was, as I understood in my own words, because I haven't gone back to the transcript, it's kind of like a minimum goal, but that it was not a maximum, and that if more could be added to the system in a reliable, cost-effective, responsible kind of way, they would. Do you think it would help this discussion at all to clarify that and identify terms for what that number is versus something else? And for lack of a better description, I think about a stretch goal in my own life. I'm putting this out there in front of everybody just because maybe there are more reasonable ways to describe it in this world's terms. What do you think?
Well, I think that it's important to understand that in these portfolios, in the supplemental IRP, their modeling constrained it, in fact, to a maximum of 300 megawatts per year in those early years. And they characterized it as an average, and that certainly Santee Cooper could procure more. But the problem with constraining it in the modeling and limiting it to only 300 megawatts is that then we don't know what the modeling would say if it were 400 or 500. We just don't know because that's not how they ran the model.
Thank you. I appreciate the reminder and the answer. Do you have witness Glick's testimony?
I don't believe I do.
Well, I will just tell you that in it there are 3 main items that they determined that they recommended or wished that PA had addressed, and I just wanted to give you an idea, an opportunity to address them. One was the ELCC for 8-hour BESS. Another was modeling of zero market interaction. And honestly, the reason I'm asking all this is I'm curious what zero market interaction is. And then a renewable integration study. And I just wanted to ask if you had any comments in response to that question.
Sure. And certainly did read her testimony. I just didn't have the copy here. In terms of the ELCCs as related to the storage modeling, Santee Cooper had relied on a 5-hour or an ELCC associated with 5 hours of storage. And I believe Witness Glick was advocating for Santee Cooper to use an ELCC for 8 hours. And I think the difference is we understood, sort of why Santee Cooper relied on that because they didn't quite have, a comfortable assumption for 8-hour storage. I think the issue is and the reason we believed that the reason Witness Glick raised this is it's all about the ability of storage to contribute to the peak, essentially. And as you have peak load conditions that may persist for more than a shorter number of hours, a longer term storage has the ability to contribute to the peak for a longer period of time, right? And so I think that the implication is that if you're using a 5-hour ELCC rating, meaning that's how much capacity you believe that storage unit would be able to contribute toward the peak, you're sort of shortchanging the 8-hour resource because you're using a shorter duration ELCC assumption, and so it certainly would make sense. It would make sense for future updates to the IRP if Santee Cooper were to use an 8-hour ELCC assumption associated with an 8-hour storage. That would make more sense, but that requires getting that study done in advance to develop that assumption before they can use it in the IRP modeling.
Okay.
And then on the zero market interaction modeling, that's also a typical approach that many utilities take. And here's why. Because here in South Carolina, there's not a formal organized market. In areas like PJM, for example, it's a very formalized energy market where utilities sort of purchase all of their load and they sell all of their generation. And so by definition, they are interacting with the market in every single hour. Whereas opposed to here, it's an informal bilateral market where, yes, they do. Santee Cooper does make energy trades and energy deals with other market participants in the region on a regular basis, but there's no, not to the best of my knowledge, there's no formal requirement for them to do so, and there's no mechanism for that to be formally required. And so they do make these market interactions. They interact with the market on a near daily basis, but it's not, it can't be considered firm the way that if you had a PPA with a resource, you are contracting for that firm resource. So basically what this is, by not modeling market interactions, they're basically saying we are assuming that we will serve all of our own load with all of our own resources. And if we can get energy or sell energy to outside of our system, that will be a bonus. If we can find cheaper energy to do deals, we will. And if we can find ways to sell our generation off system and make a return on that, we will. But from a planning perspective, it's a more sort of conservative view to say we're assuming that we're taking care of our own load, and we're not going to count on the ability to go find off-system energy because there's no guarantee of that. So that's sort of what that zero market interaction means. It's an assumption that they won't be able to find off-system energy, and from a planning perspective, in a bilateral market like this, that's a fairly common approach.
Okay. And the third one related to renewable integration study?
It it found that the witness glick was saying that integration study was based on the assumption that Winya retires in 2031, and so but it didn't. The witness glick is saying, assume that for the purposes of the renewable integration study, it would be possible to assume that Winya retires sooner than that, and you would therefore get better visibility into what the integration costs and complications might be for more solar sooner, if you had an integration study that assumed that would retire sooner. And that's a very reasonable case to make. At the same time, Santee Cooper has stated in many different ways that it will be very difficult to retire Winya sooner than 2031. But part of that reason is because they are assuming they wouldn't be able to get replacement capacity and energy online. Part of that reason is because they're assuming solar would be too expensive. And part of that reason is because of its integration study that assumes Winya. It's sort of that circular logic.
And your perspective on that?
Our perspective is it would be nice to have the information to understand what the system would look like if Winya were to retire sooner, at least from the perspective of understanding what the impacts of solar integration onto the system would be. And so I would be comfortable if the commission were to ask them to do those integration studies, assuming Winya were to retire early, just to have that information, and it would inform better planning, particularly around our recommendation for more solar sooner than what their action plan calls for.
Thank you very much to both of you. I appreciate all the education and the additional testimony.
Thank you.
Commissioner Caston.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon. Still morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Another couple minutes.
I'll talk fast. This is just my edification in your, I guess, evaluation criteria methodology. You mentioned detailed shadow assessment, which I think a shade, sun, or whatever. What exactly is that?
That was some assessments we did to look at the possibility of downsizing or hybridizing the Winya replacement capacity to be some gas, some storage, some solar. We were careful not to characterize it as rigorous reliability modeling because we didn't have access to the information to be able to do rigorous reliability modeling. But we looked at the potential economics and the potential for the gas plant to be of a different size.
Thank you. And in your report, relative to load forecasting, being more aligned with neighboring utility approaches, and I think you mentioned this earlier this morning. That's not, well, let me ask, is that specifically like Duke, Dominion, or all other utilities in the Southeast?
I think with the load forecasting and some of our discussions on that, it was really to look at the anticipated C&I growth. And as we've seen in some of the subsequent IRPs, now that we're seeing come out with Duke and just regionally speaking, they are taking that to heart when doing their modeling, looking at the economic development of the region, and just ensuring that that is also a contributing factor. And so some of our discussion surrounding that was just to be more rigorous and not only continuing these discussions with stakeholders, managing your key accounts, understanding your C&I customers in detail, but also looking regionally and understand the dynamics of South Carolina. And just the commercial and industry segment in general.
So when she says C&I, she means
excuse me.
commercial and industrial customer load growth.
Yes.
Believe it or not, I actually thought that's what you meant.
Sorry,
but
apologies.
Thank you to clarify it. And relative to that, thinking in terms of industrial, and I guess you could say residential, but industrial, I think in some questioning you had with Commissioner Carol Lee Williams, I think y'all were talking about maybe wind or the differences in regions and this sort of thing. So as I was looking at the load forecasting section and thinking about that, you know, what do others do relative to, say, industrial development forecast, just any growth? Is that still more a regional thing? In other words, what it is in the upstate of South Carolina or the southwest part of Florida is not necessarily the same as Colleton County or Dorchester.
That's correct. Without subject to check, the southeast part of the United States in general, and that would include South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. This part of the country appears to be seeing higher industrial load growth than other parts of the country, as a general rule, and it appears to be associated with industrial loads. We're also seeing a lot of data center load growth related to data centers that power most of our daily life at this point. And so we're seeing a lot of data center load growth. We don't necessarily see that. I don't think of data center load growth as occurring in this part of the country. It's much more so sort of north toward the higher parts of the east coast, where all the urban centers are. But I will say that the data centers have the potential to pop up quickly. They don't take a lot of time to develop. It's not like they're building a factory that takes 5 years to get online. Data centers can pop up quickly, and so loads can change quite quickly related to that. But to your question, it does appear that the Southeast appears to be seeing higher loads faster as compared to the national average.
And even expanding regionally, we look at transmission constraints as well. So if we're talking about data centers, and the area of Virginia has the highest concentration of data centers in the world. So if we see that as anything that's replicable across, you know, the eastern seaboard, then it is possible that that could come up quickly. And in resource planning at my own utility, having to deal with, in the past, dealing with data centers pop up and how to plan pretty expeditiously for increased load growth. The curve looks more like a whale because it's so much higher in megawatt procurement than you would need, you know, just a year ago. And so these are some of the notes that we would consider to continue to refine and investigate as they continue to refine their studies year over year in subsequent analyses.
I know there's been some, seems like discussions, questions or something relative to industrial growth and talking about the data centers. but as I think about that and hear these discussions, you know, I kind of used to think of industrial growth as like manufacturing, you know, where it required water, sewer, electric, probably gas, and not so much in terms of a Google or, you know, a data center that requires, I don't know what it requires, but apparently a lot of electricity. I don't know that it requires that much sewer. I don't know that it requires that much water. I don't know. Is there a distinction between, when we say industrial, is that manufacturing? Is that manufacturing and data centers, or data centers kind of like something you put over here?
No, that's a great distinction. I think it's important to note that base load requirement is really the signifying differential. Knowing that you're going to need that base load capacity to meet that need for that C&I customer. So whatever that base load may be, and for data centers, it's quite high, and it needs to be fairly consistently flat for reliability concerns. So in C&I's, for manufacturing as well, if it's a 24/7 operation, then yes, you will see that same sort of designation. Not all commercial and industry, you know, manufacturing operations would have that. Perhaps they have a bye week or a bye day, and so that would flux the load need. But for specifically, we're talking about data centers, or that consistent rate of supply that is required, you know, that is something that we are seeing more and more of. And the other differentials, you mentioned other utility needs like water, sewer. I mean, I don't want to over speculate on what data centers need or don't need, but I would assume water for cooling purposes and things of that nature. So it is integrated with other aspects. But similarly, I would say, in my personal opinion, absent any other comments from Charles, that it would be based on that base load energy need. That would really signify a difference of data center versus typical manufacturing.
I think that's right. You know, in terms of a high load factor, and is a data center, would it be lumped into an industrial facility or industrial customer class? The definition of those customer classes changes, right? Usually is signified by just pure size. There's no residential requirement that needs megawatts and megawatts. Tends to be a size driven, and the data centers are large, so you know we do see them classified as industrial customers. I think for the purposes of what we were talking about, it was all about we know that Santee Cooper has seen increased loads relative to when it originally developed its base case load forecast. They have said as much, that they are seeing higher loads. And so the purpose of that recommendation really was to just say, are you doing the best that you can? Are you exhausting every opportunity to identify what near-term load additions may be? And anything that they can do to increase that knowledge of near-term load additions, it will help in their planning process.
Thank you. I guess finally, and I don't remember if it was in question from Ms. Jaffe or Clancy or Carolee, Commissioner Williams. You were talking about I guess storage in the utility industry is not nascent. And, you know, thinking about what I understand that word to mean, and I don't know how long these things, how long does it have to be? Do you know how long, I guess, utility scale storage that has been tried and tested under multiple scenarios? I mean, what's the history? Do you know what's the longest history for in that utility scale size storage?
Well, I can't say when the first utility scale storage facility came online anywhere in the country. There are some old batteries, certainly, but in general, I would say that just from our own observations and the work that we've done in diligencing the financing of a lot of the storage around the country, it's really been over, not 5, but not 10 or 15 years, somewhere in that time frame, over about the last decade, is when utility scale storage really has proliferated. And again, back to Santee Cooper's position, each individual utility system operator, particularly in a system that is not part of a regional transmission organization where other people are dispatching their generation. Santee Cooper dispatches its own generation. And so it's very reasonable for the operators to want to get some experience at a smaller scale. A storage facility is a different type of resource than most other generating resources because it pushes and pulls, right, and takes the energy in and generates it back out, and just that dynamic adds a lot of complexity when considering when to dispatch it, how often to dispatch it, when to charge it. So operators do need some level of time so that they can get comfort with best practices in how to do that. How much time they need versus another utility, it's really hard to say. It's reasonable to assume that they need some level of time, but it's also reasonable to say that it's utility scale storage is very common across many grids across the country. It's not something that needs to be delayed for another decade until they get comfortable. Nothing like that. It's just, it's hard to put a time bound on it, but it's reasonable that they want to get comfortable with it, but not reasonable that they would want years and years to get comfortable with it, if that makes sense.
Think so. So what I think I heard was less than 10, but more than 5?
Yes, I would also say that a lot of the inception usually starts from a policy directive. So if we look at California and there are obligations for procurement, and even that looking at renewable portfolio standards, sort of setting the stage on procurement strategy. So for me, I'm coming from the West Coast, it's pretty standard planning strategy to have a required amount of battery storage as part of your utility portfolio, where we're seeing that now being echoed in other states, other territories. But I would say that a lot of it stems from the policy direction first in order to move the direction for the market and the utility adoption rates, because there's so much tangentially roped in. You're looking at transmission constraints, you're looking at how to make additional revenue streams, how value stacking might occur with batteries. We look at different frameworks like Lazard's levelized cost of energy for storage, and different functions that are out there, and updated studies that will give us some of these inclinations of where batteries are going, how the price points will shift, and then also how they can be marketable in the market, how they can even eventually provide ancillary services and other types of revenue products, especially if hybridized with solar.
So are you saying PA's experience relative to storage across the industry, the storage growth has been primarily due to policy directives, or because it was more cost-effective, reliable?
I would say that it's really both, right? And in many cases, the policies, particularly in California, were meant to stimulate the market for the market to come into being, and to drive the costs down of to achieve scale so that costs can come down. And at the same time, there certainly are many batteries that are in operation around the country that are not in response to any policy directive. It's because whoever installed them had a compelling business case to do so. In some cases, it was pilots. In some cases, it was a utility or a merchant operator in the organized markets analyzed things and decided that they could make enough returns to make it a reasonable investment, and they put the batteries online. So it really is a combination of both. You wouldn't be able to generalize and say it's all due to policy or it's all due to economics. It depends on the region and the circumstances.
Has PA's experience been that, is it primarily for peaking to, cap that, or some other reason?
Again, sort of depends. In many cases, a battery can see some pricing arbitrage between low-cost charging and then discharging and generating when prices are high, and it's buying low fuel and selling at high prices, essentially. So there's price arbitrage. There's also a lot of markets for ancillary services. We saw that in PJM over the last decade, that PJM had a fairly robust ancillary service market that batteries are particularly suited to participate in. And what happened was everybody saw the opportunity, and very quickly the market got swamped with an overbuild of batteries and all of those ancillary services. It's a lucrative market, but it's fairly thin, and there's not a lot of depth to that market in the PJM area. And so they quickly had a lot of batteries that thought they were going to make a bunch of ancillary services revenue, but then didn't, because they got oversubscribed. It's hard to quantify some of those things for a system like Santee Cooper, where there's no monetary compensation for a battery for Santee Cooper to provide ancillary services for its system. They just have to do it. They would pay a battery if a battery operator could provide some of those ancillary services, but there's no market for it the way there are in other areas. As far as peaking, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why we were talking about longer duration storage. Over the initial parts of storage entrance onto the grids, typically you were thinking about 4-hour storage. That was the most common batteries over the last 10 years have been 4-hour durations. But the problem is that now, in areas where there are enough batteries, if they all just discharge for 4 hours, then that just pushes the peak further out in the day, or it moves the peak, similar to solar penetration. And so that's why long duration, 8+ hours of storage is becoming the desired objective, so that it can provide energy for 8 or 10 or 12 hours and be able to encompass the entire high peak load in a given daily cycle. So, there's a lot of reasons, a lot of use cases for batteries. Peak arbitrage or peak shaving, peak moving the peak, price arbitrage, ancillary services. And they're all different use cases.
And meeting capacity needs too, which I know has been a hot topic in this proceeding.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh, and meeting capacity shortfalls as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure as soon as I quit and you guys walk away, I'll have 1,000 other questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Powers?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me be the first to say good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
One of the things I've kind of grappled with in going through some of this stuff is there really is a difference in what you see as, or what you'd like to see as far as necessary load growth. And I think your position has been somewhat that Santee Cooper is pretty much conservative with some of that. Even the industrial growth or any kind of growth, the data centers, is that pretty much where some of the difference is between the two?
We do understand that Santee Cooper did apply high scenarios in some cases when looking at public resources, like the EIA forecasts, and that did somewhat align with projections, and that there, as things were progressing during that period, if my recollection is correct, that there were updates and modifications based on stakeholder feedback to continue to improve those high, low, medium scenario cases. That being said, we would say that knowing that Santee Cooper has made those modifications starting from a very conservative base, using adaptable, verifiable assumptions like EIA, which is generally mapped and not very specific to all the unique conditions that obviously Santee Cooper needs, but using that as a base case and then adding to it based on refinements. We saw that occur as part of that development process. Now, the final results, whether that is conservative or not, I'm not going to make a determination on that at this time.
Well, and I think,
I'll look to my witness.
I think what's made me think about page 27 and 28 of your report, where you're pretty much talking about coal. One of the first statements is if environmental regulations tighten. Isn't that a political issue as to whether or not that's going to happen, or an assumption one way or the other?
When you're talking about the load forecast or
Yes, section 4.2.
4.2.
Long-term forecast generation technology.
Right. And whether or not you're asking if the environmental regulations that would impact what technologies they choose.
But as far as environmental regulations tightening or loosening, that's pretty much a political issue that's going to be solved in November, is it not?
I wouldn't say it will be solved in November. It's certainly the direction of the EPA and the proposed regulations may change depending on the administration, and if there's an administration change in November, certainly.
Well, and going on further in that section, let's talk about the labor pool for mining may dwindle. And to me, that's kind of I know cold bad, sunshine good. I understand that, and I agree that that's where we're headed. But that seems to me that that's kind of an assumption too. Probably got machines going to do that anyway, aren't they?
The economics and the technologies involved in different types of mining are always changing, and they're likely changing very latent, very well behind earlier environmental considerations, right? When you see technology and automation technology and all of it, a lot of that is just pure economics, not really in relation to a specific environmental rule.
Yeah.
But you could point back 10 years and say that those rules put into place led to the development of certain technologies that are now coming into play.
And if you would, for my benefit, the last sentence of that section, just before you start 4.3, with interconnection queue congestion and the potential low success rate of resource procurement, remaining proactive enables Santee Cooper to provide reliable and affordable energy to their customers. Could you clarify or expand on that sentence?
You know, that really was getting at our recommendation around higher levels of solar procurement sooner than what the current action plan is calling for. Given that there could be queue problems, and given that it may be difficult to find enough solar in the marketplace to meet your needs, shooting for higher levels sooner seemed to us to be a prudent way to make sure that they get, at a minimum, the 300 megawatts that they're targeting.
And to be able to close the coal plants quicker that way.
So for us, the need for solar and some form of capacity to eventually be able to replace the coal plant is necessary. If you take a coal plant offline, you're going to lose a lot of capacity and you're going to lose some of that energy. But as we discussed earlier, currently, according to the assumptions Santee Cooper is using, the solar energy is actually cheaper than the coal energy already on a levelized cost basis and a dispatch cost basis. So it would be prudent to obtain the solar even if the coal wasn't going away because it's cheaper than the coal, if that makes sense.
All right, let me go on to another subject. Electric vehicles. There's been, I would say in the last few months, it's like, oh my God, it's going to take this much power to do this because electric vehicles are trending. And trending's a word I just don't like. I mean, in fact, I'm going to pull for the San Francisco 49ers because Taylor Swift is trending. But do you see any slowdown in that? Seemed to me there was going to be a big projection of what was needed. Do you see any slowdown in the that demand of electric vehicles, or any change in that forecast as far as what's necessary for a load?
I would say it is electric vehicles are very much a regional phenomena. No surprise that in some states, for a lot of reasons, the local price of power, local policies, local incentives, as well as physical geography. There's just a lot of reasons why EVs are varied across the country. As a whole, they certainly have been accelerating. I don't know our particular forecast for South Carolina. It's typically done at a state level. I don't know what our forecast would say for South Carolina.
And local incomes would have a play in that too.
Economics, yeah, a share of wallet, absolutely.
All right. My other question is the batteries. What happens when the battery's done? Are they recyclable, renewable, reusable, or particularly with, we're talking about big batteries and stuff. What would happen long term to a battery? Is there a negative environmental impact involved with batteries?
Well, I'm not a battery decommissioning expert, but
smarter than I am.
A couple of things. They typically, one thing to keep in mind about batteries is that they typically don't have a defined life and then stop. There's a concept called augmentation. Batteries degrade every time you use them, as you.
I've got a golf cart.
Yeah, so with utility scale storage, typically what happens is they will replace certain components, certain battery cells over time, sort of on a regular basis, and that way they're in some respects constantly refreshing or augmenting the battery capacity, so that many PPAs with batteries are structured such that its deliverable capacity remains constant throughout the entire term of the PPA. And the only way that that's possible, there's two ways. You can either oversize it to begin with, and then you get your degradation to the end year of the PPA is what it needed to be, or you can augment it throughout the term of the agreement and keep that capacity sort of constant. In terms of the decommissioning of the batteries, I can't really opine on what the environmental impacts are. I know that there are some newer battery facilities that are being put into use that are aggregating electric vehicle batteries, old electric vehicle batteries that are no longer good for the actual use in a vehicle, but they still have enough life left in them that they can be aggregated and used in a utility scale storage as contingency capacity. So they are looking at ways that they can continue to get more use out of batteries, but that's about as much as
I've got a
say.
hybrid, and when I got it, I had a couple people say, "Well, what you gonna do when the batteries die on that thing?" And I kind of said, "Well, I'm trade it and get another one." So I mean, I've always wondered about battery. What happens to batteries when they're no longer of use? But thank you so much for that.
Yep.
That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Justin Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I get started with my line of questioning, I would like to hear your response, ma'am, to my colleague's question about the environmental impact of large-scale storage batteries. At least from your facial expression, it looked as if you had a response brewing.
For the environmental impact. Okay. So we are aware there are programs now for recycling batteries, and I should have specified, or we should have specified, we are talking about lithium ion batteries, which is the most tried and tested of utility scale. There are other types, there are new developments, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll just stick to what we call Li-ion or lithium ion. And understanding that over time, excavation processes have changed where maybe 10, 15 years ago, we had very few mining properties for lithium, where now we have, I believe the number, subject to check, is 16 worldwide, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when it was so few, under 10 in early years, that's actually quite an aggressive leap in the last decade. And so that just goes to show the effort of not only the mining aspect, but that also considers the different environmental cleanups and different regulations that might go. And I'm not going to speak to that because I'm not super familiar. But the cleanup process after, as Mr. Janicek was mentioning, the cell swap out process is usually something that's done either with a third party, with the battery installer, or some sort of PM manager, and that off-site recycling process is what I understand, usually somehow reused, cleaned, or at some case, whatever impurities or waste products are reviewed. I can't say that I know exactly the regulations that would speak to what that entails. But from a utility perspective, what they have to manage, even ahead of the installation, is they have to go through their environmental impact studies themselves, whether that is a jurisdiction that is requiring that or that's through their typical processes. I'm going to see if Mr. Janicek has anything to add to that, because I don't have any foundational.
Just that, they definitely do look to recycle them to the best of their ability, and that technology is always evolving.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I like to make sure everyone is heard, so I would hate for you to have something to say and not get the opportunity to share it with us.
Thank you.
Before I get to my questions, I just want to thank you all for offering yourselves as our expert and serving as such. Obviously, or I should say, for those that it may not be so obvious to, while you, PA Consulting, serve as our expert, we haven't had the opportunity to engage with you all because of our rules, and you've served in an independent capacity, which I appreciate. My line of questioning will focus on large-scale solar plus battery, or utility-scale solar plus battery, and I want to unpack some of your comments regarding what I would describe as a government-based approach versus a market-based approach, policy creating a market versus utility making a business case for utility-scale solar plus storage. Do you have an example of a utility that's in a vertically integrated market that's made a business case for utility-scale solar plus storage?
Subject to check. I certainly could point to Public Service of Colorado that is in a vertically integrated market, and I don't know right off the top of my head the number of megawatts that they are executing deals with paired solar or hybrid solar plus storage, but I know that they are in place. That happens to be because I live in Colorado, and so I know what the utility is doing. But I am certain that there are many other examples where utilities in a vertically integrated market are adding that. And the reason is, I believe, because that is more of a market-driven phenomena. What we have seen is that what's called standalone solar used to be the dominant type of resource, and then paired or hybrid storage plus solar facilities started to creep in. Now we see the development community focusing by far the majority of new projects tend to be paired solar plus storage, and it's just because of the fact that it allows the facility to provide energy outside of the period when the sun is shining, right? And so it just makes more sense, because if you've got one of the downsides of solar is that the sun sets and then the power goes away. But if you pair it with storage, it makes it a more economical project for the developer to be able to provide that energy longer into the evening.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioners. Further questions for the witness? Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I just had one question. We've heard a lot about the commitments on the part of the solar developers that don't end up coming to pass. And I'm just wondering, do you believe that there's anything that this commission can do that would help to cause those commitments to be fulfilled?
Well, I think that to the extent that some of the ability of developers to get online, to the extent that it's caused by any interconnection queue issues, certainly the commission has the power to make some regulations around the interconnection queue reform, presumably, and so that would be one way to help developers, or at least help with that problem. Maybe not helping the developers specifically, but help with that problem, and to look at queue reform as an issue.
And I would also even go deeper into that for interconnection policy and program enhancements to look at the technical requirements that go into those agreements for interconnecting new devices. And that is typically what I've seen. I've done several independent evaluations for interconnection programs, and a lot of that looks at the technology adoption and how that might have to change processes at the utility for interconnecting these generation devices. So that is one way we've seen movement toward, first of all, understanding how they interconnect, what can be changed, if there's room for change, and how to revise that. And that whole evaluation process obviously takes a formal independent evaluation. But that is one way we've seen where that can be effectuated.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Commissioners, anything further for these witnesses?
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Irvin?
thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today. I heard you say earlier that it's certainly reasonable for Santee Cooper to go ahead and have a pilot study for battery storage. So you don't oppose that part of the plan, do you?
No, sir.
Okay. And wouldn't that be the logical next step in terms of giving Santee Cooper an opportunity to assess and evaluate the battery storage for future IRPs? Isn't that a reasonable approach for them?
It is.
Okay. Are you in favor of all source procurement RFPs? Is that what you prefer to see?
As a general rule, yes, I believe that all source procurements tend to have a better outcome when the market is not restricted to providing some targeted technology or targeted type of resource bidding into the solicitation. However, there are instances where it makes sense. For example, if Santee Cooper were to do a pilot for a battery project, they're going to need to solicit a battery, right? And so it wouldn't make sense to go do an all source for the purposes of that. And I would also say that from a utilities procurement perspective, it definitely makes it somewhat easier to evaluate certain types of resources if you are soliciting them specifically rather than an all source. But having said all that, as a general rule, if you need to go out for energy and capacity, conducting an all source makes the most sense in terms of trying to get the most robust response.
Refresh my recollection. I'm trying to remember, did you speak to that in your report that we're discussing today?
Not this report to any significant degree, but we certainly covered it in the CPRE report and discussion we had around that report.
Okay, thank you. One of the concerns that I've shared in the past with Dominion and others is the fact that natural gas has a great deal of price volatility, and that can impact ratepayers adversely. I'm sure you recall the period, I believe it was 2020 to 2021, where we saw almost, 100% increase in natural gas prices. And unless the utility has a program in place to protect ratepayers, like a hedging program, as many utilities do, those fuel costs get passed along to ratepayers 100%. Do you think that that the commission should consider asking, and I believe this is going to be a joint venture between Dominion and Santee Cooper, but since we're talking about Santee Cooper now and their IRP, do you think it's reasonable for the commission to recommend that they have a program for hedging to try to insulate their ratepayers from these astronomical fuel costs? If we see another spike like we saw a couple of years ago, is that a way to try to help insulate the impact on ratepayers?
Well, and I will caution that I'm not a fuel procurement expert, but I will say that hedging programs are typically fairly effective at eliminating or mitigating volatility within a reasonably shorter time frame. They are less effective at eliminating price spikes. 5 years out, there might be a price spike. Typically hedging programs are of a shorter duration, and they're really meant to hedge against daily and perhaps seasonal volatility rather than some supply event or a weather event, the way that we've seen in some of these storms over the last couple of years. And hedging programs also are not without, they're not free, they're not without costs, and they sometimes can not, they can not turn out the best if because hedging is essentially, contracting forward at a fixed price, and if the hedging trader makes the wrong guess, essentially, you can sometimes end up paying higher prices than what you would have if prices fall. But as a general rule, hedging, as in sort of a shorter term time frame, generally makes sense if you know that you're going to be burning a lot of gas.
In terms of the proposed new gas facility, I've heard estimates from 5 to 7 years from planning to going online. Is that about the window that you would normally expect?
That's about right. It certainly is not going to be much shorter than 5, and to depending, really, it depends on the permitting and getting all of the approvals necessary. That tends to be the longest constraint, and there's a lot of unknowns there, so it could take longer.
Well, would do anything that would prohibit Santee Cooper from going forward with the planning process? For example, could they go ahead and do the preliminary work for such a gas fire facility in terms of the siting and any other regulatory obstacles that may take time? Is there anything that would prohibit them from going forward with that now?
Well, as we described in our recommendation related to the gas plant, our concern would be some type of irrevocable commitment by the utility that is going to incur costs, significant costs for the ratepayers. And our concern would be Santee Cooper making that commitment before it needs to. There are some activities that can be done that are essentially no cost other than the utility staff time. But even that, as you all likely know, it starts to become a snowball rolling downhill, right? The minute you start to take steps to put those plans into effect, it becomes much harder to unwind that and reverse course. And to the extent that Santee Cooper is in a position of not needing to make any commitments, any financial or material time commitments to the plant, we recommend that they don't make those commitments until they've studied it further, studied potential for alternate resources or downsizing the plant, depending on what those studies say, and maintaining that flexibility until the last possible moment.
Just from a time frame standpoint, when would be that last possible moment? It seems to me like a lot of the preliminary planning work could commence, which would shorten the horizon for implementation if that's what was chosen ultimately. Why can't they go ahead and do that internally so that we can have a better understanding of what their plan is and what would be justified given their increase in demand for capacity?
Well, what I would say is that I'm not a plant development expert. I don't have a lot of visibility into what those timelines are. Santee Cooper certainly does. I expect that it's also complicated by the fact that this plant is being discussed as a joint resource with another utility, and that's going to add complexity to the planning process. I would expect that Santee Cooper is in the best position to identify what specific planning activities it could embark on without making any financial or material time commitments to the plant.
Because if the plant were considered, if it turns out to be the best option, wouldn't it benefit the utility by being able to perhaps retire the coal plant earlier than expected? Is that a possible outcome?
That is a possible outcome. But again, maintaining the flexibility to pivot away from that plan is probably the best outcome until the time at which they have to develop something if they want the coal plant to be retired by the given timeline.
Well, I certainly understand their sense of urgency given the fact that our population is growing rapidly. I think we're now the #1 state in the nation for population influx this past calendar year, and that's on top of the economic growth and development that we've seen. So I can certainly understand their concern about getting things rolling from a planning standpoint. So I guess my question is, what would you recommend that the commission do, if anything, at this point, is a reasonable and prudent way to go forward so that they can meet their needs and provide not only reliable but affordable energy for their service area in the future?
Well, I would recommend that the commission request Santee Cooper not make any binding commitments to the plant until it absolutely has to.
and you're not willing to say, in terms of a timeline, when would they absolutely have to in order to, where would you draw that line?
I think that Santee Cooper and their potential development partners are in a much better position to identify that time. The commission could certainly ask them to identify that time. I don't know what it is.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioners, any further questions for these witnesses? Hearing none. Thank you very much for being here and for explaining your report and responding to questions. We certainly appreciate it. Y'all plan to stay for the after lunch session with the other witnesses? I'm just asking.
Yeah,
okay.
Probably.
All right. Just
Thank you.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. You may stand down.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Commissioners.
Since we're approaching the 1 o'clock hour, let's break until 2 o'clock for lunch, at which time we will hear from the Sierra Club's witness and Santee Cooper's witnesses. Thank you. We are in recess until 2 p.m.